Can you guys see that? Okay, that'll be the last time you see this logo. So thank you for joining us for Project ACT. That's Achieving Capacity Together. And I feel like we really have these past 5 weeks. So thank you again for being part of this and helping us address your needs with this. As you know, this is our mission. We feel like we fulfill it every day. We especially feel like we've been fulfilling it with you guys. We're connecting you with resources and creating a caring and more effective nonprofit community. So thank you for being part of that. You help us in turn get this mission out and completed for this community. So what we do, here are a few of our programs and initiatives. You can read more about any of these on our website. So why we're here today, as you've all heard, you've all been impacted over the last year or so now by everything that's been going on in our world, and there's no escaping it. Especially when you're working from the corner of your bedroom now, life and work just sort of overlap, and dealing with every kind of crisis just comes at you from all angles. And we know you have been inundated with a lot of things that no one anticipated, and so the point of this process was to take the feedback that we got from you in one-on-one conversations and in answers to our grant applications, about what your biggest challenges were, what you're struggling with, where you could use some help. And we tried to put all that together and address as much of it as possible through this nonprofit workshop series. And we are so grateful to Suzanne Smith from Social Impact Architects, our speaker today, who took this on and just said, oh, I've got this, stand back, hold my beer, I've got this, I can help you guys. So many of you heard her speak the first week, and so she's back again today. And we're going to be really honing in on that 2021 action plan that we've kind of held out as this kind of carrot on a stick. It really is happening today. This template will be available to you. Some of you have asked me about it. So today is the day for that, and we will be going through a lot of meaty stuff today. So I really urge you to pay attention. So with that, I do want to introduce our dynamic duo today. We have Suzanne from Social Impact Architects and Stacy, our very own Stacy Caldwell, the CEO of the Community Foundation. Both of these women are innovators and change makers. Both of them don't sleep. They have so much energy. I hope they don't spontaneously combust today, having them both together, but I think you're going to get a lot out of their wisdom and experience. And with that, I will turn it over to them. So Suzanne, I will give up the screen to you.
All right.
And you guys can take it away.
Do you want to kind of introduce kind of what we're going to be doing today as I get the technology all worked out?
Sure. We're talking a lot about strategy and governance today, and we're so glad to have a lot of board members here. We really appreciate that and know that this has been a challenging time for board members especially, so hopefully this is an opportunity for you to feel the support that we all want to give. And thank you for your service, your volunteers in most cases, and we know it's been a challenge. So are you ready, Suzanne? Is there anything else?
Ready. Perfect. Can everybody see the slides? Awesome, good. So we're here. And so I have my, in this case, sidekick, Stacy Caldwell, to be giving color commentary. She and I have known each other for, I don't even want to know how many years because it will age the two of us, but just let's suffice to say, we didn't have to color our hair and we didn't have to use a lot of moisturizer back then.
Well, and I didn't live in the desert back then, Suzanne.
And so I've got two different things I'm going to cover today. One is that action plan, which we've been talking about. And then the next is governance. And so today we have a number of new folks with us who are board members, and both of these things are in the purview of what you should be doing as board members. And so they are part of good governance, really figuring out what your priorities are. And so I've been on both sides of the table, and I've been a board member. I'm actually board chair of a nonprofit, a startup that is working with African-American minority-owned businesses and helping them get going here in the North Texas area. But I've also been a CEO, and I've also been a consultant working with a number of different nonprofits. So today we have a lot of collective experience here, not just with me, but with here in the Zoom room. And so I hope you will have this be a vibrant conversation. In fact, I always try to retitle my slides. This is certainly governance. That's the official serious title. But if I were actually to retitle it, I would call it board confidential. Like, this is going to be the moment where we talk about all those confidential issues that you always wondered about and you never knew the answer to. We'll be talking about all of those things in this presentation. Let's first talk about action planning. So as we talked about, that's kind of the carrot on the stick for this. And even though I am a consultant today, I spent quite a bit of time in the nonprofit sector. And one of the reasons why I'm a consultant, as you heard in the first session, is because I just didn't like any of the consultants I met. I just didn't feel like they were really coming to the table with a lot of value, and particularly for the price tag that they were asking for. And so I'm a big DIYer, whether it's a DIYer in my house or whether it's a DIYer when it comes to the nonprofit space. And so you don't need a consultant to develop an action plan or a strategic plan. It certainly helps. It helps to have that level of objectivity, but you can actually do this yourself. And so each of the sessions have been designed as like a stair-step process to get you to this action plan. And so I'm going to walk you through kind of that final step of how you put this together. And so as we go through this, we'll be talking about potentially what your next action could be in development of that action plan. So I always like starting with cartoons. It is Friday. It has been a rip-roaring week for me here in Texas. And so I think today I need to laugh as much as anything else. So this presentation is going to be loaded with all sorts of cool little cartoons just to bring a little bit of levity to our Friday. It is TGIF. It's our last session. And this is one of my favorites. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but it actually is an oldie but a goodie. It says, "The picture's pretty bleak, ladies and gentlemen. The world's climates are changing. The mammals are taking over. And we have the brains the size of a walnut." So the good news is all these things are still happening, but we have brains, collective brain power that can help us get through a lot of this. I'm seeing that today here in Texas with all the different people who are pitching in to rebuild our state and to come together to make sure that our neighbors are taken care of. And so the good news is we really have the ability to overcome any obstacle that's in front of us. And I was telling Stacy earlier today, it has been through the sheer force of the nonprofit sector and neighbor that we have actually accomplished what we've accomplished in Texas, as arguably our policymakers and our systems have failed. And so I think that's why I love working with the nonprofit sector, because we're the doers. We're the people who are out there shoveling the snow and talking to people, and also spending time talking about how do we not have this happen again? How do we disrupt the system? And then, there's this other one that I always like too, which is, what if we don't change it all and something magical will happen? And I hope after these 4 different sessions and now the 5th, you'll realize that this isn't where you need to be as a board, and as a executive team. We may not have a line of sight of everything that's going to happen in 2021, but we have enough of a line of sight that we can at least start putting our foot in front of us. And that's part of the reason why I'm calling these action plans, instead of strategic plans, they're your battle plans. This is what you think might happen. This is what you want to do. These are your intentions that you want to set for 2021, not knowing what could happen in 2021. When are we going to get the vaccinations? What is the weather going to hold for us? What's going to happen in our communities? What's going to happen with the economy? What's going to happen with the new president? We have some speculation, and I know more than I did yesterday. And certainly in our first session, I know more about what's possibly going to come down from DC. But we have to be prepared for anything. So we've got to get around the table and really not expect for magical thinking to happen, but to really put our step in front of us and say, what can we actually accomplish today? What is in our line of sight that we can actually accomplish? And as I mentioned in the first session, but as a reminder for those who were there, but for a refresher for those people who weren't there, we want to create this flywheel effect. So nonprofits are just like for-profits in the sense that we really want to kind of activate all the different things that we have, and at the center, the first thing we've got to focus on is our impact. Then we move to brand, then we move to revenue and operations. At the core is governance, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And so we're going to be activating all of those things through this webinar series. And that's really what is going to be at the heart of your action plan. And that will create the strongest organization possible, which will allow you to be as sustainable as possible. Also, as a reminder, these are the different types of plans that you could create. We're going to be reflecting on the action plan and the bridge plan in particular, because again, this is really a temporary plan that you're going to be creating for 2021 that is either going to be a bridge plan or an action plan until we have a better line of sight in 2022. So here are the steps that I would recommend, and I'm, as all the other speakers have done, I'm happy to talk to any of you guys at a later date to talk you through this. But let's just assume that you don't have a plan at all, or the plan that you had maybe was done in 2008 or 2010. So it's really what I would call an obsolete plan. It's not really, you guys aren't governing yourself based on that plan so far. So if you don't have a plan, I would encourage you to start fresh and create what I call an action plan. So again, because our line of sight is really just to 2021, what are we going to do in 2021? What are our major objectives to try to create? So I would rewatch or review the slides, and you certainly can bring your board members into this conversation. You may want to conduct a life cycle assessment. So if you'll remember the life cycle that we created and see kind of where you are and make sure that you're not experiencing growing pains. You may also want to do a SWOT assessment, which we'll be giving you as a template. You may also want to be doing a program review. We're doing program reviews, a lot of our clients, and we've recognized that some of the programs need to be updated, or they become obsolete, or they need to change. We talked quite a bit about that in the first session, that because of technology, because of the new needs that our clients are going to have, we may need to actually rethink how those programs actually need to exist in order to best serve that population in 2021. And then brainstorm various ideas you got from the presentation, and then triangulate all of those things to create an action plan that answers the question of what will best stabilize us as an organization, because obviously you need to be stable this year. What is the best use, the highest and best use of our time and resources, and what is going to prepare you for the future? So this gets into some of the infrastructure issues. So if you've never had a database before, or there were some things that you don't have from the past webinars, maybe it's in finances, maybe it's in marketing, are those some things that you could take on this year to prepare yourself for the future? So those are some of the things that I would suggest if you don't have a plan. And here are some of the tools and some of the templates that you'll be getting in an email shortly after this webinar. Remember the life cycle. So that's one of the things that you can calibrate your organization against. This is also the template we use for the program review, where you could really look at, how do we want to move this program forward? This is the SWOT analysis that you could do, and you can do SWOT analysis on two levels. You can do it at an organizational level, but you can also do it at a programmatic level and say, what are the strengths of our program relative to other organizations? What are some of the different weaknesses that we might have? What are some of the opportunities that are on the horizon, either through policy or changes in the environment? And what are some of the threats? And this allows you to figure out, should the program continue? Should it be amplified? Should it potentially be sunsetted? Should you put it on hold, until you understand more about what the political climate's going to be or where funding is going to come from? So those are all the things that can help you make some of those strategic decisions. And then we've also given you a template so that when you record the SWOT, you can then present this back to the board or present it back to your program team and make a collective decision around where are we going to focus our time and attention. And this may be the time where you need to prune the tree a little bit and figure out, there's this one program that is taking up a lot of time and energy, but we're just not getting the impact that we were going to get, or we're not getting the funding to really support it. And you may need to prune it or put it on hold temporarily and let other things kind of grow out. And there may be new programs that you need to have. There are new things that are happening in communities every day that you may decide that you want to adjust what you're currently doing in your program offerings. So the SWOT analysis kind of gives you an opportunity to take a look at all of those things kind of in a uniform way. Questions on if you don't have a plan, kind of what those steps might be. Any questions in the chat?
Nothing in the chat so far, but if somebody wants to put something in real quickly, we'll certainly address it.
Okay.
Hi, Suzanne. My name is Alexis Aller, and I'm with Mountain Area Preservation here in Truckee, and I serve as the executive director. I've also been a board member for other local nonprofits, and I guess I think one of the things that I'm kind of coming up against is we had a strategic plan created for our organization 2017, 2018. Our goal was actually to refresh that in 2020. That didn't happen because I didn't feel as though we had a good grasp. Like you said, like the climate is continuing to change. And so my question to you is that what would you suggest for organizations that do have that plan? We have exactly what you said, put some things on hold, some things we've kind of pruned and changed a bit. But I've also in the process of doing board development, and I find it really hard to engage new board members while I've also kind of put refreshing our strategic plan on hold. So I thought, I just was curious if you had thoughts about that, because really that does all impact the overall plan for an organization, because it's hard to do board development right now, period. It's hard to do anything, but just
Actually,
thoughts, ideas on that.
I absolutely do. In fact, I couldn't have planned that question better, because here's part B. So if you do have a plan, what we're suggesting that you create what we call a bridge plan. And I've equally been working with my clients on this. And so our suggestion is you do what we call a bridge plan. So you have an existing strategic plan that is your governing document, but it may or may not be in the right place for where you are right now. So take that existing plan and evaluate each objective using our assessment. And I'm going to flip to that assessment so that you can see what it looks like. So what we do is we take every single objective, and you're going to get this Excel spreadsheet. So I see people taking pictures, but we are completely open source. And so you're going to get all of this information, because the last thing I want you to do is spend time creating Excel spreadsheets. So we're going to give you the Excel spreadsheet, but that we made a pretty version of it. So this is an example from an actual client who basically had in their culture section. So just like you, Alexis, in 2018, we said, here's the objective. They wanted to create a staff of team players. So what they did is they evaluated themselves against it. And so they gave themselves an A, B, C, or D. And in this case, they gave themselves an A, but in other places, they gave themselves a C. Then there's a decision of completed. So meaning it's done, you keep it or you modify it. So if it's completed, you take it off your strategic plan because it's done. On your bridge plan, or you may decide to keep it because you want to continue to be team players. So it makes sense that they would keep this. And then we also have comments here. So in the original version, there was lots of notes here. Of course, I didn't want to share that with you because of client confidentiality. But then also new things have cropped up. So we all have recognized in 2020 that we all need to be much more intentional as a result of our diversity goals. So they decided in their culture section that they would add a diversity goal. So this is an opportunity to bridge yourself from your existing strategic plan and update it so that it is relevant for the times in which we're in right now. So it's a great board development tool, Alexis, because they actually then get a state of the state. So here's the state of our organization. Here are all the objectives that we're A+ on. Here are the objectives we've kind of fallen short on, or maybe obsolete, and you just need to delete them. So this particular organization had done a facility renovation. Well, that facility renovation was done. And so we were able to delete that off the strategic plan. And you'd be surprised how good it felt to that CEO that she was deleting stuff off of her strategic plan, because it meant that her mind share, got reduced in a lot of ways. So what she did is took the existing strategic plan and then just kept certain objectives, added new objectives, and then created a dialogue with the board about why this was going to exist. And so you can do that as a staff and an executive team and do this assessment, or you can do this as a board staff combo. But typically you can do it anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. It doesn't take too much time depending on how much detail the strategic plan is. And so that's what I would call a bridge plan. So continue anything that needs additional work, sunset anything that's completed or obsolete, and then add anything needed based on your current assessment or new learnings. So remember, the diversity goal is one example. And then again, rewatch all these sessions from past presentations, do your life cycle assessment, do a SWOT analysis, brainstorm any new ideas, and continue to ask yourself the question of, are we stabilized? What is the highest and best use of our time? And then what is going to prepare you for the future? And so what she did in this particular situation is it then gave her a brand new strategic plan, and she was able to then say to the board, our big rocks for 2021 are X, Y, and Z. And so everybody was laser focused on those things. So it's similar to a brand new action plan. It just refreshed their existing action plan and brought everybody into the conversation of, in 2021, here's where our focus areas are going to be. And so that would be what I would recommend. So let me check in with you, Alexis. How does that sound? Any questions from that?
I mean, that's great, because I really have been sort of struggling to figure out what our next step is. And like I said, also doing board development. So it's actually a really good, this is perfect for something for me to bring forward this year, so that I can not only re-engage, but, you know, a big part of our role with our strategic plan is really getting that full buy-in. And I think after such a turbulent year last year, it's really good to refresh things and also be realistic. And so I really appreciate this concept of a bridge plan, because I've really kind of been hitting my head against the wall. And I also don't want to keep delaying process and planning. So I appreciate that.
Well, and again, I'd love Stacy to give color commentary on this. I think funders appreciate the fact that you are putting effort into planning, but recognizing that what you need right now is maybe less of a strategic plan and more of a battle plan. If you think about it from a military point of view, you know, part of what you're trying to do is think through kind of what the scenarios are going to be this year and then plan forward as much as possible. And then in 2022, you can revisit the idea of, do we have the time and the energy and the resources to do a full-fledged strategic plan? Because again, in 2022, hopefully, fingers crossed, our line of sight will be a lot farther. You know, we'll know kind of what needs to happen as a result. We'll know where our economy is heading. We'll know the ramifications of some of the policy shifts that are probably going to be happening this year. And we also will hopefully have COVID way behind us, and it'll be kind of in the rear view mirror, hopefully. And so I think in 2022, we'll have a sense of where those things are coming. And maybe that's where we do a refresh with you guys on what a DIY strategic plan could look like. You know, how do you do a real intense strategic plan for you as an organization? Stacy, any thoughts? Or Phyllis, any other thoughts to kind of fill in from your perspective?
I would just say that what Alexis brings up is kind of true for a lot of us. And same with TTCF. In 2017, we rolled out a strategic plan that took 18 months because we completely changed our business model. And we are still in it, and we are very close to having completed it, but we're not in a position to launch a new strategic plan. So we're also in that kind of bridge moment. And I also would just echo that the SWOT analysis is such a simple way to look at any aspect of your business operations, programming, and governance. So your board could use that to just reflect on, how's the board working? You know, or how is our communications working? Or, you know, what does community outreach look like? And so I just think that the exercise of that bridge analysis with the layering on of a SWOT analysis of certain topics within your strategic plan that need to be unpacked a little bit more. And finally, I think missions have to have energy. And as boards change over time, they bring different passions and different skills that create energy and momentum behind pieces of your strategic plan. And so when we all kind of get back to whatever normal looks like, you might find that there's certain things that you just don't have the energy and expertise at the board level to pursue. And I think we have to be okay with that. I think we have to be okay with kind of putting some things down that, you know, based on the SWOT analysis, takes a ton of energy and doesn't deliver the kind of impact that we had hoped it would back in 2017. And so I think, you know, this is a time to also just speak truth. And as you do your board development, Alexis, I think that's the kind of candid conversations that people are willing to have right now. And a lot of one-on-one board conversations that I'm having about what's working and not working, because I'm just trying to honor where people are in their life. And another Zoom call is really hard. And so just one-on-one touch bases of like, where is everything feeling alive in the mission for you? allows you to really hear what they're leaning into and where they think the direction of the mission is heading.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the other thing I would do is, and I'm encouraging my clients to do this, is that and I actually personally am doing this, to be quite honest, is I'm giving myself a lot of grace in 2021. And while I have really good innovative ideas, I'm putting them into a file folder for 2022 and saying, for the future state, I want to redo my website. For the future state, I want to do these things because I need to take some things off my to-do list and create buffer for myself. Knowing that 2021 is going to be just challenging getting through it and slogging through it. So in addition to creating your bridge plan, I would encourage you to create kind of a 2022 future planning. For the future strategic plan, let's consider this. For the future strategic plan, let's consider that. And just that there's a relief that's associated with just putting it on a future plan. So you're not doing it, but you're creating what we sometimes call a parking lot, where you're putting it on a list somewhere and it is going to be considered in the future and you're not forgetting it, but you just realize it's not possible for 2021. It's just not doable given all of the resources. So giving yourself some grace, I think, is also very helpful. Got a thumbs up from Stacy on that one. Okay, so we did get a question in the chat, or a note in the chat, and I'm going to try to pull it up here, but if the team sees it before I do, feel free to comment on it.
No, it was just Stacy agreeing with you 100%.
Okay, good. Double agreement.
Yes.
So strategic plan assessment, you're going to be getting this in the email shortly after this webinar, so within minutes after the webinar. And it's an Excel spreadsheet. So it's a cool little self-populating thing, and you guys are welcome to use it. The sample's in there just so you have it, but it also shows where you can also add additional decisions as well. So the best part about this is we're going to give you lots of samples. And as I mentioned to you earlier, if there's not a sample that you see that fits you, I'm happy to go into my treasure trove of various strategic plans and see if there's one that could help you. But this is the sample template that we're going to be giving you. You guys saw this before. I went ahead and kept the objectives in there, but the sample does not include any of this. It's basically a fill in the blank version where you can put your logo in it. If you know PowerPoint, it should be easy for you to change it to your logo colors. But if for whatever reason you don't figure it out, my team's happy to help you with that. But it's basically just moving boxes around. But this is what the template looks like filled in. And this is a good example of an action plan. So not a bridge plan, but an action plan for a relatively new organization. So a startup, and I know some of you fall into that category. This is also another example of a strategic plan for an arts organization. So I wanted to give you guys both a human services and an arts example. And again, there is no pride of authorship on this. So if you like, the strategic objective, you can borrow, you can absolutely take that objective and say, yes, we need to cultivate an advisory council too. And so let's just include that on our 2021 plan. This is a sample of a strategic plan. So Alexis, for your benefit, this was an example from somebody who did a bridge plan. So you'll see that they bridged it. It originally ended in 2020. So we bridged it to 2021 and essentially, created a new strategic plan. You'll see where they added the diversity goal in there. So this is an existing strategic plan. And then it was updated January 26th of 2021. So this is an example of a strategic plan for a human services organization. And then here is a strategic plan for a arts organization. So you can kind of see what their bridge plan looked like. Any questions about kind of the action planning process?
I've got a question, Suzanne. I'd like to hear your thoughts on potentially having two different plans, having like a board level plan, 30,000-foot view, and then a staff level plan, and how much detail is appropriate, talking about specifics and measurables in a board level plan. And if that's too detailed, the conversation, happy to connect.
No, you guys are cueing me so well. I love this. Okay, so once you have this one-page strategic plan, and you guys know I'm a fanatic about a one-pager because I just feel like that's the way we need to go. That is your high-level strategic plan. It's the one that's going to go to funders in your funder applications. It's the one that the board is using. It is your document that it out and into the, this is the bonus part. So if you guys have the time and energy to do what Chase is talking about, I would encourage you to then take every single objective and turn it into a dashboard. And so for us, and I'll include this in the materials, I'll include our Dashboard 101 session, which we can't get into today just in the interest of time, but we'll send it to you. We have the one pager that is really the external facing document, our battle plan, our strategy, but then behind the scenes, there's this lovely dashboard. And I want you to think about it like an automobile dashboard. And I want you to think of like a souped up automobile dashboard in 2021, where you have all the indicators, and the indicators tell you, how well you're doing, how far you've gone, all those kind of things. But there's also GPS. The GPS also tells you you're going to go from here, and then you're going to go here, and then you're going to go here. And so for us, a dashboard not only includes all the activities, but it also tracks your level of completion. It also says who's doing what, and then it also tracks the metrics associated with it. And we can include a sample if you guys are interested in doing a dashboard. But as you can see, this gets into the nitty-gritty detail. And since we've got a lot of board members, let's take the board member one. So cultivate a board whose members are active, serve as ambassadors, and are accountable to organizational goals. Provide board experiences. We go into the detail of that's the CEO as well as the marketing chair's responsibility. So the marketing board chair. Offer at least one board experience a quarter with 55% attendance. So this was external board experiences. So going on a tour or providing an opportunity for the board to engage in the mission. Share mission moments at 80% of board meetings. Board reports greater comfort with storytelling. So I'll show you that example in just a little bit. But when you get to board evaluation, this is how the board evaluates whether or not board experiences have engaged them. Adopt formal commitments and use governance committee for training and accountability. And you can see here are all the different metrics, how often they're supposed to attend a committee, how often they're supposed to attend an event, whether or not they make a financial contribution. So you can see a dashboard gets into that nitty gritty detail, Chase, that you're talking about. That's the kind of behind the scenes stuff that funders don't need to necessarily see, but it's an opportunity for the board and the staff to be on the same page of what does success look like? And what it does is at an incremental level on a quarterly or every 6 months basis, you can then take these activities and say, how are we doing on these? And for some of our clients, they even will create a red light, green light, yellow light scenario. So red light meaning we're really behind, green light meaning we're doing really, really good. And at that particular board meeting, they'll discuss all the red lights and say, what's holding us back? What's bottlenecking us? Or what do we need to be doing better with? Or when we get a metric back and maybe, for example, only 60% of board members are attending meetings, they say, our goal is 75%. What's getting in the way of that? Are we not scheduling them in advance? Are the board meetings not interesting? Do we have a couple of board members who've gotten too busy and can no longer serve on the board? What's the story here? And that's where the board then holds itself accountable for attending board meetings. So it's a good agreement around where you want to go. So let me check in with you, Chase. Is this kind of what you were looking for?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Good. And so what we do is in each of these different sections, we have a slide. So let's take this one as an example. So there would be an Excel spreadsheet on culture. There would be an Excel spreadsheet on impact, brand, and all of these are tracked together, and you can really see progress over time. And so I can share a template so that you guys can see what that could look like. So once the strategic plan is done or the action plan in 2021, if you want a bonus, because I think the plan is really the most important part, but the bonus would be you guys doing some type of performance management system. Remember, we talked about performance management in the last class at a brief level. And so if you want a refresher, you can go back to the first class, and then you populate the organizational dashboard with how you want to measure the performance of that objective and those activities. And I've given you another sample here. Another way of talking about metrics is KPIs. So you could also call them a KPI, and you can see some different samples here. So again, if you guys do decide to do this bonus category with your action plan and you need some ideas for metrics, let me know. And I wouldn't overcomplicate your metric. Again, your metric is supposed to be your shared agreement with board and staff as far as what does success look like. And so You just need to be thinking about what is that, what do you want to measure as far as what makes the most sense? And it could be a progress measure. So remember we talked about paired measure. It could be a qualitative, it could be quantitative. So it could be either or. Any questions on kind of the action planning part?
Nothing in the chat.
Okay, so just real quickly, I know that I'm a lot like you where I go to all these webinars too, and our goal was for you not to just absorb the information, it was really for you to act, and this is why it's called Project Act. So I'm not going to hold you to this, and I'll have Stacy and Phyllis, shade their eyes right now, but I'm just interested because we've spent all this time together and I feel like I know you and you guys are family now. How many of you guys are either going to create an action plan or do a bridge strategic plan, or at least are considering it? And you can either do a thumbs up or you can actually do kind of a emoji. Okay, good. So a good amount of you guys. Okay, good. Well, my goal, just so you know, because I'm metric driven too, and I even told this to Stacy, is I want at least 10 coming out of this session. So just so you know, I practice what I preach. So I have metrics associated with this webinar series. So that's going to be my goal. So hopefully I saw 10 thumbs up. So I'm really counting on you guys to help me meet my metric. Any further thoughts on action planning before we dive into governance, or as I like to call it, board confidential? Okay. Well, it's appropriate that we bookend this webinar series with governance. We started out with strategy and culture and impact, and we're ending with governance. And there's so much to say about governance, and I know that you guys look forward every year to Stacy's longer version of governance, but we felt like we at least wanted to give you guys some thoughts relative to governance, because it is an important element of why we exist as nonprofits. We're unique in the way that our DNA is built, and that it is a board staff partnership. And so this governance part is not only important for staff to understand, but it's important for board members to understand what their role is. And I'll honestly tell you, I want this to be an opportunity for each of you as board members and CEOs to walk away, much like with the other webinars, with one or two things that you want to do differently, that you can then put in your action plan relative to governance. And that's also why Stacy's here to kind of give color commentary too. So as you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask them. So governance is one of those words, and I mentioned this earlier, that's really this buzzword where we talk about governance, but depending on who you talk to, they give you different definitions of it. And it's a little bit like the Supreme Court decision on pornography, where the Supreme Court justices said, you know pornography when you see it. And so governance is a little bit like that. When I go to a board meeting, I can feel good governance. Like I can see when a board is actively engaged. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. When I was working with a client one time, and I always go to board meetings before I actually start working with the client, because I want to see like what's happening at their boardroom. She was so excited to invite me to their board meeting, because she's like, oh, we are so productive. We get so much stuff done. And she's right. Her staff gave a lot of updates and her boards nodded their heads and they were like, okay, this is good, And so afterwards she wanted me to do a debrief, and she goes, don't I have a good board? And I go, no, you have a bunch of cheerleaders. You don't have a board. They didn't ask you any questions. They didn't challenge any decision you made. And honestly, they barely glanced at the financials. I trust you and they trust you, but the point of a board is for there to be a double check on everything. And so I like board meetings where there are a couple of board members who are saying, you know what, let me play devil's advocate on that. And I like it when a CEO says, you know what, I don't have all the answers. You're here as a board, and I'd really like to know, what do you think about our website? Or what do you think about our social media strategy? Or what are other nonprofits that you give to doing? Because I don't have all the answers. You're here to help me as a focus group in a lot of ways. That's what a good board meeting is. And it's that interaction and a little bit of healthy tension. I think tension's a good thing, by the way, and a little bit of healthy tension. And so to me, governance is really an actively engaged board where people leave and they feel like they've contributed. They feel like they have been engaged. But I also will say that even though we use the litmus test of meetings, I will say to board members that you're a good board member if you come to meetings. You're a great board member when you do things between meetings. You're not a board member just when you're at that meeting. You're a board member every time you get on an elevator, every time you go to coffee, and you get an opportunity to share the story of that organization. You know, whether you're on social media and you're sharing it, whether you're, you know, in a coffee shop and you see someone interested in the environment, you say, hey, have you heard about this nonprofit? Your friends and family know that you're on the board of that nonprofit. You're the ambassador for that cause, you know, and that's what a good board does. And so I put this graphic on here because I think it gives you a sense of everything that goes into governance and why it's so difficult to define. But when you see it, you know it. You know when someone's being a great board member. You know, so the board feels accountable. They feel transparent, you know, like decisions are made and everybody knows why decisions are made. It's typically very efficient, you know, so they're valuing their board members' time and making sure decisions are made efficiently. Course, following the rule of law, which we'll be talking about. They're inclusive, so every board member gets an opportunity to share their voice, no matter how long they've been on the board, no matter where they come from. They're always thinking about the people that they're serving. You know, in fact, a lot of technology companies keep an actual seat that is not filled that represents the customer. And I know some nonprofits have adopted that and said, we're going to always at every board meeting have a seat that's not filled, and that's being filled by one of our clients. And so they'll pause every once in a while as a board chair or others say, what would that client say about this decision we're making? Are we being inclusive? Are we being transparent? Are we doing enough to serve their needs? Because that's why we're here, right? We're here to serve those needs. It's participatory, where you don't see any one person dominating over the others. You see lots of people participating. And when they don't participate, there's always a really good reason why they're not participating. And they talk about any issues that are going on in their life that may cause them to not participate for a month or so. It's consensus oriented, you know, and that they recognize that that healthy tension needs to exist. And that part of the reason why they come together as a board is because they know that no one person has all the answers. And that the research says the more people who are in the room, the better the answer is going to get. And it's being led by a board chair who really is there to lead that consensus and oftentimes puts their own needs or their own opinions behind and really lets the board get to that conclusion together. And then it's responsive, you know, and it's an actively engaged board. And in many ways, it's a separate organism from the actual organization that is in a symbiotic relationship. So it shouldn't be something that's led by the CEO. It should be led by the board itself. And that's what a good board really is. And then a great board does even more than that, you know, and is doing all these other things. And so that's when I see these things, you know, and I would say you may not be perfect on all of these, but I would say if you have 75% of these on a regular basis, you're really accomplishing a lot. And it's a work in progress. It's like any of the rest of us. We are constantly on a journey. So you get new board members and your board changes. And you have to kind of, you know, that's the complexion of your board's going to change. But it's something that at any given time, you go into a board meeting and you feel like they are actively engaged, actively participating, and they're making the best decisions they can with the resources that they have. Stacy, any color commentary on what your definition of governance is?
I have so much color commentary on this topic, you know, and I've been taking some notes and I think I'll weave them in. I really love this slide though, Suzanne. And I love that you've also said something to the effect of, if you've got 70% of this, you're in good shape. Because I think, you know, boards can consume a lot of our time and energy. Well, let me say it this way. Boards will consume a lot of your time and energy because it is your role as the executive director to be that backbone connection for the mission. And you can choose for that energy to be always scrambling, trying to respond and kind of not focused with them, or you can use that energy in unison with them in a way so that really advances the mission. And so I have thoughts, you know, about that, but I think this is really a beautiful way to look at it kind of more globally and just kind of get an intuitive sense on where you think things are, because, you know, sometimes it's really difficult. I've only had board of directors as my boss. I mean, both my parents were entrepreneurs, and so I'm very used to the CEO private sector role. But coming out of college, every job I've had has been running a board of directors and running a mission. And so I've had really great board members, really difficult board members, and I've seen what a good board starts to look like when it starts to get aligned and humming. And you can get really caught up, and it'll take up so much more of your energy if you don't put the things in place to make these types of things happen. And if you don't come to the table as the executive director, kind of looking for and expecting these types of things to happen and building infrastructure and policy around it. So I won't belabor that, Suzanne, but I will look for more opportunities to interject just some more tactical ideas around these areas.
Absolutely. Well, this is the lens. And so we're going to be talking about not each of these individually, but we're going to be touching on these and talking about what does it actually mean to be accountable, et cetera. So the first thing I wanted to clarify is that there are different governance models. And you may have heard these, you may have heard like words like the Carver model or different things. And I think one of the areas of tension where I see things go astray is when we all come into our board experience, both the executive director from their perspective, but also each individual board member with our own mental model. And many of you may be familiar with Peter Senge's work, The Fifth Discipline. And he talks about that we all have mental models anytime we come into a situation. You know, Stacy just talked about her mental model from her parents. You know, I have my own mental model from my parents and my board experience as a CEO. And now I have my mental model as a board chair and what it's like. So we all come in with our mental model. And one of the things that I think distracts us from moving forward is not agreeing on our governance model. And if you'll remember our beautiful life cycle, I want you to think about it in terms of that. And I want you to think about it just kind of from a common sense perspective. You know, so boards shift as the organization matures. So you have a lot of differing views on a board when somebody's in a startup mode, because the board almost serves as quasi staff in many ways. So that's what I'm doing right now with as board chair for this startup, is I'm taking on what would traditionally be some staff roles, you know, helping out with different things along the way. As I have a brand new CEO who's the first time he's ever been a CEO. And so that's kind of the board operating model. And you may not even have a CEO at all. You may not be lucky enough to. And so that's where you have a different governing model. And then on the flip side of that, you may have a very sophisticated organization. So you could think about some of our voluntary organizations like the American Heart Association or Boys and Girls Clubs, where they have more of a policy governance model, where the board comes in on a regular basis and they set the boundary and says, you know, here's the strategic plan, and it's up to you as staff to accomplish that however you think makes sense, but we're going to hold you accountable to it. We're going to come back on a quarterly basis and see, have you met the metrics? Have you followed through on those things? And that's really the other side of the equation of the policy governance model. So you've got 1 and you've got 4. And then there's these shades in between where you move from being purely a volunteer-led organization to starting to hire staff. And the gray area is typically where there's a lot of ambiguity. And so I'd encourage you both as a CEO and executive director and as a board to choose one of these models and say, this is the model that we're agreeing upon for who we are today. And there isn't a right or wrong answer. It really is about having a shared mental model of what the expectations are. Because I will tell you, as someone who mediates tension between boards and CEOs all the time, and I truly do mediate these differences of opinion, one of the things that always exists beyond communication issues and beyond personality stuff, it's always that they have a different view of what their performance model is. And it's that boundary that's set between what is the CEO's authority and the staff's authority versus what is the board's authority. And if you can clarify this up front, you will save yourself a lot of anguish and pain moving forward. And so I would encourage you to kind of, if you haven't already explored the various policy models, and you can get lots of books on this, and I have condensed it down to these 4 because there can be 8. I think 8's just a little bit too overwhelming, but no, it's a continuum. And it starts with being all volunteer led, and it moves to this policy governance model where you're pretty much staff led. And the board is just checking in on you and making sure that there's a boundary set as far as what you do. I personally like the ones in the middle, because I think that, I like it when the board actually really understands what's going on in the organization. And so policy governance can sometimes be too rubber stampy for me. And I will tell you, I've had a number of nonprofits who've moved to the Carver model or the policy model, and they've gone back to 2 and 3 because the board has become too disconnected from the mission. So just know there is no right or wrong answer to this. This is what is best for you and what is best for where you are in the life cycle. And it should always be a partnership between you and the board, and there should always be clarity between the CEO and the board around what policy governance model you're following. And as new board members come in, they have to assume this policy governance model. They can't change it. This exists. This is what the agreed upon agreement of this board is. And so you may have some board members who want to get in the middle of the business and micromanage, and you may have to have a board chair who says, time out. That's not our policy governance model. We don't micromanage when you feel like there's a staff person, and we're going to get into some of those scenarios in just a little bit. But this is where you get into painful issues if you don't agree upon this. Because this is so important, let me stop there and see if there's any questions or color commentary from Stacy about this one in particular. So just
there are some questions in the chat, just to bring your attention to that are a little more tactical around board size, if there's anything ideal, and what the norms of term limits are.
Perfect. We'll get to that for sure. So just by a show of hands, and again, I'll make sure Stacy and Phyllis are not looking. How many of you have an established policy governance model or a governance model? It's about 25%. Okay. Well, I would encourage you, this isn't something that has to be done in a strategic plan, but is something as a board for you to figure out what that needs to look like. And I'll honestly tell you too, this has to shift. I have a couple of nonprofits where it's all hands on deck right now. And so board members who were just coming to meetings now are pitching in because they've kind of gone backwards because the environment has shifted so much. So they've made a strategic decision in a board meeting saying, you know what, we're going to go from 3 to 2. That's really our goal for this next year because this is an all-in kind of issue. And so we need all hands on deck. And that one in particular is a food bank. This food bank has so many things going on that some of their corporate board members are stepping in and helping them with some different things that they need to take care of because there's so much need in their community. So just know that this also shifts and it can change and morph. And in 2021, you may need to revisit where you are. All right, and now to the questions that you guys are asking. And I'm going to give you kind of my best, examples here. Stacy's going to as well, but just to give you a sense of kind of what is typical with a board. And there again is no right answer, but I'll kind of give you my sense as far as size as well as term limits. So fiduciary responsibilities, I think the first rule of thumb for me is first do no harm. And so we come into these organizations to help. And so you got to really make sure that you're not causing any harm. And that does include, causing too much chaos within the staff ranks. And we're going to get into some scenarios if we have time of like, what do you do in these given situations? And there has to be agreed upon kind of a social contract between the CEO and the board about what to do in those particular experiences. And of course, all the stuff that really exists from a legal perspective. So you have to have financial oversight. Our agreement, our social contract as nonprofits is that for nonprofits to have its tax status, there has to be independent oversight. And that's why there's all sorts of issues related to who's on the actual board. And you have to have this community board that is essentially operating the nonprofit. And that's the agreement we have around our tax status. And so you have to have this body who is double checking your work. And that body then is the one that is responsible for the work. And so I've had a number of board members who didn't realize that they were responsible for those things, didn't realize that they could get sued independently if those things don't happen correctly. And so just know that that fiduciary responsibility exists the minute you sign that board contract. And you got to make sure that you're asking the right questions to make sure that there isn't any fraud or isn't any issue. And so all those things are incredibly important from a finance perspective. So every board member is responsible for that, not just the finance chair. All legal and ethical issues, making sure you're making good decisions related on ethics, overseeing any legal responsibilities. So really looking at any lawsuits, anything that's going on, any potential risk, And then ensuring that all the board members are acting in good faith and being a self kind of governing body. So it isn't the responsibility of the CEO to do anything about board members who are maybe not acting in good faith. It's the board itself who takes responsibility for those. So there's all these fiduciary responsibilities. And then there's the strategic part. And these are the things that aren't as expressed as much, but these are all the things that as boards have evolved from the 18th century to today, we've taken on more of these parts. So organizational planning, having the resources to carry out the mission, that includes fundraising, evaluating the chief executive. So the only staff member you have responsibility for is the CEO. And that is a very important role that you play in letting the CEO and the executive director know how he or she is doing in that role. Recruiting new board members, acting as a cohesive group, serving as ambassadors, financially supporting, and then when needed, pitching in and augmenting staff. So those are the other duties as assigned. So let me stop there. Any questions on kind of these duties? Stacy, anything you would add to this?
I would add a couple things. I think the term fiduciary is maybe not a norm for a lot of volunteers who show up to an organization. And you really touched on something that I actually start my entire board governance series, which is who owns the mission. And understanding the privilege of a tax exempt status that you have to steward in a way that doesn't threaten that status. And so your time on the board, there are some responsibilities that you can't get out of. And if this isn't the right time for you, or if the lift is too heavy, you have to be very honest with yourself, because there's personal risk involved, not to mention reputation, as well as the integrity of the mission. And when the mission loses integrity, it sometimes can never recover. When something goes awry on, inside the mission, suddenly donor confidence in the organization starts to diminish. So it has this ripple effect. So back to the term fiduciary, there's 3 duties that you have to think about as a fiduciary. I have a hard time saying duties. I have 3 teenage boys. And so every time I say it, it kind of cracks me up. But so your 3 duties as a fiduciary are duty of care, duty of obedience, and duty of loyalty. So what duty of care means is that you are showing up to make decisions as a board prepared. You've done your homework. You've read the financials. You've read the board packet. You actually read the minutes that somebody's going to say motion to approve, so that you're not just kind of quietly going, yeah, I'm glad they looked at it. I'm with them. So duty of care is really making sure you have the time to inform yourself and educate yourself about the decisions that you're making as a board. Duty of obedience is obedience to the mission. You were chartered as a 501c3 and approved by the IRS for a certain mission. And so you really need to keep it in check if you start to maybe in your strategic plan, start thinking really creatively of like, well, this mission is kind of outdated. We've really looked at it and we want to go in a completely different direction. Well, that's not what you were chartered for. And so you always have to bring it back to the mission. And it doesn't mean you can't rewrite your mission statement or even really rethink whether this mission is still relevant in the world, but you have to obey what you applied for at the IRS level. And if you're going to significantly change it, you need to kind of go back and change it. You can't. I've heard of organizations repurposing 501c3s. Like, well, we still have this 501c3 over here and nobody's really been paying attention to it for a while. And, we've got this thing we need to do. And so let's just use that status. So I think that is not being obedient to the mission. And then finally, obedience of loyalty. And this is a really big one in a small community in which we have board members that we share, and that is an inherent conflict of interest. It was something that I had a really hard time coming from Dallas, where, the C-suite opportunity for board members was abundant. So people who had, these skills like being attorneys and accountants and, marketing people and all that, we could pick from just a wealth of, different networks. And here in a small community, there are less people to choose from, and a lot of our missions need board members. And so part of why TTCF launched the board governance series is to train more board members, because if the excuse is there's just not enough people to serve on boards, then we believe we should be growing more boards. But the reality is we share board members. So duty of loyalty is really what helps you navigate those conflicts of interest. And it's the idea that when you show up somewhere on behalf of the organization, you're really wearing that hat, and you're clear about what hat you have on when you're speaking to other community members. So I'm here for TTCF today. And you're not trying to kind of have side conversations that are kind of multiply beneficial across all the organizations. And I know that's really hard to navigate, and I know that's really hard to control. But duty of loyalty is the conversation you would have with your board members of like what you expect from them when they are kind of wearing a lot of different hats in the community. So those are all the duties associated with being a fiduciary. And I think it's a really healthy conversation to bring to your board, instead of just saying, well, we're fiduciaries. That doesn't just mean looking at the financials every month. It really means this kind of embodiment of responsibilities. Thanks, Suzanne.
Perfect. So the next slide is titled best practice, but I'll give you a disclaimer. I really hate that word. If there was a better word, and if you guys ever come up with one, let me know, because best assumes it's the practice versus a recommended practice. And I think recommendations are different. As you guys know, I grew up in a very, very small town in Texas. When I was born, they were excited and they changed the sign because, our population grew exponentially as a result. So I know what it's like to grow up in a rural community, and I have just as many clients who are in rural and suburban areas. So just know that when I talk about these are all just recommendations. And then also too, you should follow your state law associated with this. And so you should have a lawyer you have access to that will take a look at your bylaws and make sure your bylaws are in compliance. So first of all, board size. And my opinion about this, and we had a good question about this too, is that I am really influenced by a lot of the work that I did in my MBA with professors around what is the optimal group size to get cohesion and to get decisions. So you can have a super tiny board, and so your law may, or your bylaws may say a super tiny board. You may also be an arts organization where they're used to like 30 people on a board. My personal belief, based on all the experiences I've had, that I think kind of 9 to 15 is a good range. You don't get into quorum issues that way. You have a good cohesive group of people who know each other and are cohesive. Because again, as a board, you look at individual board member and you look at collective board members and coming together. So that's really the size I like. And when it gets too small, you don't have enough people to really have a good quality conversation and to have good ideas. And if it's too big, people can kind of isolate themselves and never participate. And it's hard to engage at various board meetings. So if you have a big board, one thing you may want to do is think about creating an advisory council, and rolling board members off, because there is an opportunity, because the board does have all of this legal and fiduciary responsibility. And I use that word responsibility and accountability because that's what a board is. But a counsel can be someone who just is that, giving you counsel. So if you have someone who just really likes to give you advice, or maybe as a luminary or a legend in your own organization or your own community, they may be better equipped to be on the council. And so think about kind of people's strengths and weaknesses and kind of what role would they best be on associated with this. So I would just encourage you to take a look at your board size. When we get to one of the slides about board evaluation, we ask people board size, and there is not a right answer here. So I would encourage you first to look at your state law and see what's required. Second, to look at your bylaws and see what's required, and then figure out, based on where we are today, is your board size the right board size? Are you able to get to quorum? Are you able to staff your committees appropriately? And really just figure out kind of what's going to work best for you. So committees. So this is something I feel really strongly about. All the work of the board should be done in committees. That should not be done at the board meeting. The board meeting is an opportunity to have strategic conversations and for the committee to report their conclusions. So finance committee should say, I think we should come up with what, as John told you in a previous seminar, what our operating reserve should be. We did due diligence on this. We looked at other best practices. We looked at our finances. We're making a recommendation to the board that it be 8 months. Then the board deliberates on that after the committee has done the hard work of doing that due diligence. And so committees to me is where the work is done. And that's why having a robust committee system is highly critical. The other reason why I think it's so critical is because you also want to create leadership succession. So to me, your committee structure is your farm team. So if you think about baseball, my dad was a coach. And so what's the farm team? It's the committee chairs. When the committee chair then does a good job, then they get promoted to being board chair. You know that they can then actually handle their role as a chair, as a facilitator of conversation, as an instigator of scheduling, as a person who can continue to move the ball as is needed in their given committee. And if they can't, they shouldn't be promoted to board chair or the executive committee. So it's a proving ground for you to have these committees being well functioning. So I put some examples, and I know committees are oftentimes one of those areas where you may decide you want to have less is more. I also encourage you to limit your bylaws when it comes to the committees you're required. You don't have to say all the committees that you're including. They can be also ad hoc committees. So standing committees can be finance. You always need a finance one. Audit can be part of finance. Nominating and governance, I oftentimes will see that go together, and you'll see that I believe in a very active governance committee, that really is working not just when they're nominating people, but they're actively making sure the board experience is quality. And then if the board is large, you may want to have an executive committee. And then I encourage ad hoc committees, which means a time limited committee or task force. Sometimes I'll call them a task force to differentiate from a committee on program, on strategic planning, and then they can meet when necessary. You may also then have an ad hoc committee on your anniversary or on a capital campaign. You may want a development committee. That could also be part of your finance committee. So there's lots of ways that you can configure the committees. And you certainly want to do it based on what makes the most sense for your organization and kind of from your strengths, essentially. So Katie asked a good question on committees. What do you recommend for a board of 5 in terms of committee work and assignments? So that is where I think you have to be creative about the committee work. And the other thing you may want to think about is committees don't have to just be board members. You can also include volunteers in those. So you may have somebody who, because of their role, like maybe they work for a bank, they can't actually serve on a board because there's a conflict of interest, but they would be willing to serve on your finance committee. And they're not on the board, but they actually serve on that finance committee. So that's another way to get some existing people involved in your committees. I would also encourage you to, this is where millennials and Gen Zers can be very helpful and be really good worker bees in these areas. They need experience, they need leadership experience. My first board, I was 21 when I served on that board. And I was a program participant, and it gave me lots of experience in the nonprofit space. And I got a lot of hands-on experience, but I also contributed greatly to the mission of the organization. So I would also encourage you, if you have a small board and you want to keep it small, to consider having committees, but include program participants, include staff, include other people who can help you populate those committees to still do the work of the organization. So that's another way to actually kind of expand your bench strength when it comes to the role of those particular committees. Term limits. So this was another question that we got. So I'm a big believer in term limits, whether it's in Washington, DC, in the state and boards. I just think turnover of views is very, very helpful. And I'm agnostic whether you have 2 years, 3 years, whether you have different terms, but I do think that it's helpful to have no more than 6 years of service on a board. So it could be 3 2-year terms, or it could be 2 3-year terms. But the truth is our lives are changing rapidly. And so people need an opportunity to do something new, do something fresh. You need refreshing of the blood. And so if you have a great board member, they can always sit out for a year and then come back if they really want to. But having them leave is a good experience in succession, because no one person should be the essential linchpin for any organization. And so you can also move them on to an advisory council. So I think term limits are really critical. This is one of the areas where I always check the bylaws of my nonprofits to say, are you in compliance with this? We don't have right now a very disciplined IRS where they're coming in and actually looking at all of this. But just know, if you ever do have legal issues and you're not following your bylaws, that'll be one of the first things that, a disgruntled employee or a disgruntled board member, or that'll be the first thing that comes up, is that you're not in compliance with your bylaws. So your governance committee and your nominating committee should be tracking all of this, and a year before someone rolls off, be looking for someone to replace that individual. So there should be a regular succession plan, not just for the CEO and executive director, but also for the board, to really make sure that you're thinking about it. But I would encourage probably no more than 6 years within a given organization. And I know what you guys are saying, there's not enough supply of board members, but I work in a number of rural communities, and what they do is they recycle from each other. So someone is falling off the board of the Arts Alliance, and that, the Arts Alliance ED and CEO is saying to her nonprofit friends, who's rolling off your board that I can pick up, because clearly they love the board. And so then, the food bank took that person on and said, okay, now this person's going to be, fundraising chair for the food bank. And so you can recycle among yourselves too. If you have a great board member, most people want to be board members for life. I've always been on a board. Stacy's probably always been on a board. And so just know that you can find these people, and you also need to collectively groom these people. And that's why I encourage you to get these millennials and Gen Zers who probably are eager to serve in leadership positions and are eager to try out their college degrees, their graduate degrees, but have very little experience. You can get a lot of their energy and their time serving on your board, and they can be really great bursts of enthusiasm to your board, and they can serve on these committees, and then they'll be ready to be board members in 5 to 10 years. So I want you to think about you guys collectively as an opportunity to build up the leadership within the area. I would also encourage you to talk to people locally as people move in. I know you've got more people moving in, and there's lots of welcoming committees. There's lots of leadership development programs. There's a lot of companies, and talk to them about when you have a new bright spot person coming in, let's talk to them about what kind of board they should serve on. Let's get them involved. And so you collectively should be cultivating the future talent of the area. So I know it's hard, and I know in rural communities in particular, it's really a sticky issue, but I feel really strongly that you have to recycle board members. Like, it is just part of the healthy part of being a nonprofit, that you have new ideas. So the officers, again, I feel also really strongly that you shouldn't have an officer that hasn't been a committee chair, that you haven't actually tested through the experience of what they're like on a committee. Have they been successful in these particular roles? So you do typically need to have each person individually in the role. Sometimes secretary and treasurer can be combined. I do like having executive committee meetings. It's just a healthy thing for boards to do. The startup that I'm working with, we don't get to have them very regularly, but we still have them when we can, because everybody's so busy and they're kind of dealing with the normal parts of our work. Just watch your state laws too, because sometimes the president and the secretary need to be different. So you may need to have someone separate that is being the secretary and putting together the minutes. In most states, you have to have these as being different roles. And typically, even if you have a secretary, the CEO has an assistant who does the minutes, it's still the secretary's responsibility to make sure every vote is recorded, and the board chair to make sure votes actually happen. Using Robert's Rules of Order or whatever it is you decide they need to have happen in order for boards to happen. So let me see if I've answered all of your really, really good questions. I know I have one more.
Suzanne, I had one that came to me, I think, instead of everyone, asking if you could address the concept of board overreach.
Yes, and so we have a slide at the very end where it's a scenario slide that we do with a lot of our board retreats that I'm giving to you. And if we have time, we're going to talk through this. But in my opinion, board overreach needs to be curtailed at the very beginning. Like, you need to have, again, that social contract that starts the day they start as a board member. They need to know, is it acceptable for me to reach out to staff members or not? Is it, when I see a staff member do something wrong, what am I supposed to do? Again, I am a person who gives people a lot of grace and understand that everybody comes to things with different mental models. People also have such energy and enthusiasm for the mission. And so I find when someone overreaches, they're typically doing it just out of energy and enthusiasm, and oftentimes just not really carefully considering what actually is appropriate. And so two things can sometimes happen. You've got those people who overreach, and I think that's a conversation that, again, the board should have with that individual, depending on the situation. So it should be a board chair and or a CEO executive director conversation, and it should be a private conversation. And it should be not a slap on the hand, but more of a, you know what, we really have to make sure we're following the rules. And when you contact staff and I don't know about it, here's what happens. And I know you didn't mean it this way, but this is kind of what we're going to do moving forward. And
Hey, Suzanne,
yeah,
it's Colleen. I'm the one that kind of brought that up, and
yeah.
it's a little bit beyond contacting staff. So overreach meaning, for instance, a board member has this gazillion ideas and is very ambitious and assures you they will take on the work, and you just know that's not going to go down that way, and it's going to go on your plate, which is already maxed out, and you don't want to say no because it's a board, it's, you know, a chair or vice chair, or, you know, a significant board member, and you're showing them that we're maxed out and this is our workload, and yet you have these 4 or 5 very ambitious ideas that you just know are going to fall on your plate. And it's just, you know, that's the struggle. That overreach is just assuming that there's bandwidth to take on more and more and more. Like, how does that, yeah.
I've been there. And again, this is where I think you guys as a board coming up with your contract with each other is really helpful. So one, having a governance model, but 2, in your board orientation, going through these various scenarios. So the scenario that you're suggesting, so you have a different, I misunderstood when you said overreach. I was assuming something different. This scenario happens all the time where you have board members who have all these great ideas. So I would encourage both board and staff to adopt an opportunity assessment, where anytime a new idea comes into the pipeline, you treat every idea equally, and that you do an assessment of, is this the right time? And I can send you some examples of what those opportunity assessments are. And we also have a blog on this too, that talks through, like, when a board member comes in with a new idea, you then say, you know what, I'd love to consider that, but here's what I need from you first, X, Y, and Z. You know, and it's the research behind that idea. What other nonprofits are doing it? When you think about this idea, what resources would it take? And what I would say to you is that in the experience I've had, because I've had CEOs who've adopted this, 2 things happen. It goes back to that volunteer and they forget about it 80% of the time, or the 20% of the time they truly care about it. And then, you know, it's a real priority. They come back with that documentation you need to do that opportunity assessment. And you're like, okay, this person's really serious, you know, and this may indeed be a really good idea. And so if you give them that bypass where you're not saying no, but you're saying, you know, here's what the criteria is for any new idea in the organization from staff or board, is that that person, or that they can get a team of people to help them if they want, they can recruit other people, need to come back with the organization with certain things that we need to document before we upend our resources and do anything different.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, so I can send you that blog, and I'll make a note of that we'll add that in the materials.
Thank you. That's fantastic.
It then puts the onus on the board member to validate that the idea is actually a good idea for you right now. And then there's a way for you to actually then deal with all those ideas. The one thing that I would encourage you to do, though, is it can't just be for that one board member. It has to be across the board. You have to do it with fidelity across any new idea that exists, including your own. So just know that there is some discipline associated with it.
Great.
And Suzanne, I would just add, sorry, I didn't mean to, I thought, you know, I think it always has to tie back to the strategic plan, or kind of what the whole board has agreed to. And I think in those, that kind of social contract that Suzanne is talking about, you know, good policy infrastructure builds a culture where board members know how to act within the mission. And if you don't have good governance and policies of like, how do we onboard a new board member? How do we orient them to the strategic plan before they even get to come to a board meeting? So that they can start to see, because a lot of times if they don't see the whole picture right up front, then they start to drill down into the weeds and you're like, no, we're kind of on a journey together that we all adopted and agreed. And so if you're bringing in board members after a strategic plan has been adopted, it almost takes a little bit more extra time and care. But once you have good governance infrastructure that's documented, then you're basically giving them the roadmap or the rules of the game for the organization, and they know how to fall in line and be a player, you know, on that team. And, you know, I also think that you really have to place value on your mission. And, you know, the organizations that I see that are not successful at managing a strong, healthy board are the ones who are always scrambling in that conversation. And so, you know, if you're really proactive and kind of always, you know, cultivating, always engaging your volunteers to that next level of maybe being on a committee, to the next level of being, you know, on the board, and you're really actively managing that, you're placing a value on your mission. You know, maybe you ask people to apply to be a board member. You know, I think as a volunteer, a lot of red flags go up when you've met somebody that, you know, for the first or second time, and now you're asking them to be on the board. Now that might happen if you're the executive director and, you know, your board members know a certain person who is going to bring a new voice to it, but really be intentional about that piece of it. And then the last piece I would add, and Colleen, I think I've just learned, you know, when Suzanne went through those models, I've always kind of been, you know, I get the working model and the governance model and the management model and the collective model. And I do think that from time to time, you have to negotiate in real time where you're at and what they're asking of you. And so when these things come up, either on a one-on-one, you can actually say, all right, so do you want me to agendize that for the board discussion? Because I actually do think it drives this objective of our strategic plan. And like, you can see it, but you don't know how it's going to get done. And so you need to just agendize it. But even at the board level or committee level, when these big ideas come up, you know, you have to be able to just kind of ask questions of how you're going to navigate the decision making around whether or not you're going to go forward doing it. And then lastly, on that kind of negotiating your governance model, you know, none of us really know the perfect governance model ever. Like, you know, you just have to have certain kind of qualities in place and values in place. And so I think it's pretty regular for me at a board meeting to say, you know, in the preparation of the agenda, is this an action, or, you know, do you need to approve this so that we're good, or are you just looking for board consensus so that staff can run with it? And especially in 2020, we had to negotiate governance in real time because we had to make a lot of quick decisions. And yet I didn't want the board to feel like we were far away from them in decision making internally. So we had to develop new models of governance in the middle of a crisis. And so just as an executive director, getting used to having those conversations about, like, this is a governance question. How do you want me to handle this? What level of oversight do you want to have? When do you want us to come back to report to you progress? Does it fit under a committee that wants to oversee it? Like, asking all those kinds of questions will help you get their head in the game of like, oh, that idea just went down 4 layers of process and we need to take it seriously because that's going to, you know, overwhelm, you know, staff or something like that. So thank you.
Thanks, Stace. That's awesome.
I think those are all really good points. I would also encourage you that you shouldn't share this responsibility alone. Your board chair should also be, in my opinion, it's peer pressure. Like, that person is responsible for the board member. And so I don't have my CEO and ED talk to the board members about their behavior. I talk to board members about their behavior. And so that is a real important role that the board chair plays in the governance chair. So just know that when you start going down that path, or you start seeing a pattern, that's an opportunity for you. And I check in with my CEO at 9 o'clock every Friday morning. And I'm like, what's going on, what's happened, you know, and he's copying the emails from other board members. If he's getting them directly, I'm letting him know what's going on. And so we have a very candid conversation about what board members are not showing up, what board members are doing their job, which ones are not, who's AWOL, you know, that type of thing. And that's the board chair's job. It's not a CEO executive director job. And so, and that's where these courageous conversations need to happen. What about the other side of the equation? What if you had a board member who either is retired on the job or needs to retire on the job? So that's the other courageous conversation, that it's really up to the board to have that conversation. So if you're the ED, you need to say that the person is either not showing up to meetings, not participating, causing issues, or maybe no longer has the time and energy to devote to the mission. And then you need to strategically have that candid conversation. I encourage you, if you haven't done any kind of board training on courageous conversations, I think that's a good board training to have, because there's going to be lots of tension, and navigating tension and conflict is just a natural part of what we do anytime we're coming to consensus on anything. When it comes to retiring board members, I think it has to be a very personal conversation. So I can't give you, unfortunately, a recipe. You guys know I love recipes and templates. There is no recipe or template. Having that situation for me to talk it through with you, always like anything, that they figure out that they need to leave on their own, that you're not asking them to leave. So you've got to go to them with the board commitment. You've got to go with them with their behavior. You've got to grace that you should be giving that person, and then ultimately helping them to a decision around this specific.
Suzanne, I'm going to interrupt you. We're getting a lot of feedback from a participant who's unmuted. I just direct chatted them, hoping perhaps they will mute themselves.
So I would just encourage you to have those courageous conversations, and know that that's part of your job as board chair, to initiate those conversations and delicately handle them on behalf of the board. You're responsible for board engagement, not the CEO or executive director. Anything else on best practices? And again, I'm happy to do any follow-up conversations about your unique situation. We did have a quick question from Meg around, if you don't have any program volunteers, are there other ways to get people involved? We struggle with any pipeline as a result. So we're going to get to that on board recruitment, but I know Stacy's geared up for that one in particular. And so how do you get new board members? So I know that that is very specific to your community. So Stacy's going to address that in just a couple of seconds. So let me quickly just kind of run through the litany of different things that you need to think about from a checklist perspective. I think it's always good in every strategic plan to be updating your policies on a regular basis, because HR changes, legal changes, D&O insurance changes. So you need to be thinking about your give or get policy. And I know in the fundraising section, we talked a little bit about that, but I'm a big fan of having something there that is connected to your overall organizational size and your board members' ability to give. I think it's really critically important that every board member gives or gets. They must sign a conflict of interest statement every year. And so I encourage you to do that at the same time every year. So every January meeting, every annual meeting, get them to sign that. Code of ethics, same thing, those can go together. And so you may want to update the code of ethics. So if there's something that has been breached previously, you may want to update that code of ethics. Obviously with Sarbanes-Oxley, there's a lot of people who updated these policies, but if you haven't, you need to make sure that you're up to date with all of those. Whistleblower fraud, again, that's the same thing. All of those things come to the board. So you've got to make sure that the staff are doing their job to make sure that employees who potentially have something like this can feel like they can come to the board. So it's important to me as a board chair that the employees see me and they know my email address, so that if anything happens in the organization that they feel like they can't go to the CEO and others, that they can report those things unofficially to me anonymously. So just making sure that those are posted adequately to employees as well as volunteers. D&O insurance, this is one that is critically important that you have D&O insurance. One just side note here, unfortunately, there's been a lot of organizations that have popped up recently selling nonprofits cheaper D&O insurance, but just know when you get it cheaper, you may not have all of the protections that D&O insurance should be giving you. So just be careful, because there's lots of things that can happen. And you just need to have as much protection as possible. So this is something I wouldn't go on the cheap for. unless you're really thinking through like how you would mitigate that, or maybe have an endowment or something that can buffer if you can't potentially get insurance for something that happens. And then of course, Stacy did a fantastic job of talking about self-dealing, and I use the same analogy. Always know what hat you're wearing any given time. And so self-dealing is one that we've really got to pay attention to, so that anytime we're conversing with someone, they know, are we acting in our official capacity or an unofficial capacity? And knowing when we enter the room, we're operating under that particular hat, and we should only be operating under that particular hat. All right, so I know board recruitment is a hot topic, so let's shift there. So I wanted to just give you a sense of kind of what I think about when it comes to board recruitment, but give the bulk of the time to Stacy to kind of talk about your specific situation in the area and the region. So some questions to ask yourself. You know, part of it, you got to think about what is the right mix and makeup of your board to meet the demands of the organization. And I'll be giving you a template to kind of take a look at your existing board, but it's helpful to look at that gap analysis and say, okay, what actually makes sense for our organization? So if you're geographically restricted, then it should be in that geography. You know, if you are serving youth, you probably need to have some people who are younger and represent youth. If you're serving seniors, you may want to have more seniors in the group. You want to really understand why people are joining the board. You know, I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek, and people join because they're emotionally connected to the organization. So you've got to find people who have that emotional connection in any way that you possibly can. You have to be clear on expectations, and I'm going to be giving you lots of templates around board contracts, board expectations, etc. And then you also have to understand that, again, this is a social contract. People are joining because they're hoping to get something out of this too. You know, they're wanting meetings that are well done. They're wanting, enjoying the mission, enjoying each other. So there's certain things that they have expectations of you too. So in addition to having expectations of them, I would be very clear, and anytime I have a new board member that I'm talking to, I say, what are your expectations of us? And if their expectations are too high, I'll say to them, look, we're a startup. We can't actually meet all those expectations. Are you going to be okay with that? Or are you going to dive in to help us actually meet those expectations as a new board? So really think about those questions as you're thinking about your board recruitment. As I mentioned, we're going to be giving you an Excel spreadsheet where you can do a board composition analysis. I think this is helpful to do on a regular basis to see when their term expires, how many years are on the board, all the various diversity angles so that you can be as inclusive as possible. And so we'll be getting this Excel spreadsheet to you. So I think that's a very helpful tool to have. And then you'll automatically see where your gaps are. You'll see, we don't have anybody who knows PR and marketing. We don't have anybody who's a funder. We don't have anybody who's Hispanic. I was working with a board recently who all their board members were from North Dallas. And I'm like, that's a problem because you all have the same network. You need people from East Dallas and you need people from South Dallas because you represent the entire community. So also pay attention to where people live geography-wise. And this checklist is one that I always include in my live presentations, and we go around the room and kind of share these. But these are all some things that, again, you could share with your board and say, here are some of our expectations of you. And you could trade these off and say, which are these the most important? I think promptly responding to emails, knowing staff names, knowing the organization's work, being able to tell the story, showing appreciation. You know, part of our job is being a cheerleader and making sure that the staff know when they work hard, sending donuts, sending pizza, you know, letting people know that you're there watching their good work, engaging their network, pitching in on their new ideas, right, Colleen? Pitching in on their new ideas. Understanding that they only see one part of the equation. So coming from a moment of grace and saying, you know, I may not fully understand this, but have we ever considered X? Doing what they say they're going to do. Treating staff as partners, not as subordinates. That's a very important one. Filling their tables at events. You know, all of these things are really critically important. And so I encourage you to share this with your board and have a conversation around how are you doing on these things as a litmus test. So Stacy, I know that the question has come up that you guys live in a community where the supply of board members may be not what nonprofits would like. What are some tips you would give them related to the question on how do they build the pipeline? How do they find new board members and volunteers?
I think you really have to activate your board in that process because they're looking, and particularly, you know, your vice chair, you know, the leaders that are kind of coming into their own in the organization, because you want them to be thinking about they're building out their team, their team that's going to help when they're in that leadership role. They're going to want strong players on the team. So I think, to that end, when can they introduce you to people within their network that might be interested in the mission? So one of our expectations annually is that each board member makes 3 meaningful introductions to me or to the mission. And so it might be bringing somebody to one of our events. It might be hosting a coffee with me to learn more about TTCF. Or it might be sitting down and making an ask. Those are a little bit more rare because we don't tend to want to meet people and ask for something. We really want to broaden our network, and whether that network is somebody who could potentially just benefit from TTCF, maybe it's a new nonprofit that needs to learn the landscape, or it's somebody who could potentially be a board prospect or a committee prospect. And so, across a dozen people every year, I should be getting 36 new introductions. And I'm talking to the board members about what is it that you think is a connection here that I can help cultivate. So that's one way of doing it. And another way that we have been, I would say it's about 50-50, but when there's somebody that we want to really accelerate into a leadership position, we'll use our board retreat, which we do twice a year. We used to do it annually once a year, but they wanted to break it up and do like a social experience and a half-day board retreat. And they wanted more time to unpack conversations more frequently because our board agendas are run by the minute, almost like a public agency, which is a whole other conversation. But, board retreats give you an opportunity to bring them like more nourishment and food for thought around the mission, to explore a book or an article that's relevant to your mission. And so we use our board retreats oftentimes to invite people who are kind of in the back of our minds as candidates. And sometimes we'll even ask them to bring their expertise. So, we'll ask them to take over 1 hour of our board retreat and present on a topic that they know something about. And we get to watch them in action. We get to both learn, the board gets to engage, we get to see kind of how they work together, and then they're sitting there for the remainder of the retreat on other topics and weighing in. And so we get to kind of create these meaningful moments and connections. And then the last piece on recruitment is, and so many of you have heard me say this, but I just stand by it. And Suzanne, this goes back to my Dallas days, which is, I don't like-minded people. Unlike-minded people are going to change the world, because when you have a room full of unlike-minded people and you come up with a solution, it's more likely to actually stick and make systemic change. And so you don't want to have a board that's all the same type of person, to Suzanne's point, just by nature of being in the same geography, you've had a certain set of life experiences and economic, opportunities or not, that puts you in that one place. And so really expand beyond kind of your normal usual suspects. And so when those 3 meaningful introductions get made to you, really press your board members, I want to meet your best friend. That's awesome. But I also want to meet maybe somebody in your company, maybe a business colleague that you just think, showed up and did a great job on something. And so, push them to think beyond the usual suspects. Thank you.
I totally agree. And Chase brought in a good point that I've recently, kind of come around to just from my own experience. And he asked, what about some of these people who are second homeowners? And so as Stacy knows, I recently got married to a pilot, and pilots make an insane amount of money for very little amount of time, but they do a lot of work when they are doing it. So we recently bought a small cottage on the lake in a community outside of Dallas. And so we spent equal amounts of time between Dallas and Maybank. And it's interesting because we now have less allegiance to Dallas and are now wanting to do more in Maybank because there's so much need in that community, that rural community. And both of us come from rural roots in many ways. And so I think the right board member probably will recognize the opportunity. And keep in mind, as they build their second house, it may end up being their primary house eventually. Because my husband just asked me this last weekend. He's like, could you ever see us retiring at the lake house? I'm like, yeah, I could totally see us retiring at the lake house. And so we're already built, and this is only after a year. So I would just encourage you to talk to the right people. And if you know, they are philanthropic individuals, and now that we've become acculturated around Zoom. So a year ago, I would have said, oh, I don't know if that's a great idea. But now that Zoom has become so popular and people are remoting in from all sorts of places, I think you're going to see more remote boards where some people are in person and some people are over Zoom, or some people are over conference call. And we're going to see that as being much more commonplace to get quorum. So I would encourage you, if they're setting down roots in your community, they want to give back. And so you may have some people who continue to start spending more time at their second homes because of their remote nature of their work. So I actually think going into 2021, that's a very positive trend. And so I'd encourage you to potentially think about that. I mean, Stacy, Phyllis, I don't know if you guys have any viewpoints based on your on the ground experience.
I do want to just add that TTCF intentionally added that as a stakeholder group about 9 years ago. And we had a governance discussion, because what you don't want to do is create kind of two different boards. So you need to be intentional about integrating those opportunities and putting expectations on attendance, just as you would with any other board member. And I do think that Zoom has provided an opportunity that I don't know if we can go back, because with our second homeowners, they used to conference call in, and that was really difficult. They were not engaged because they couldn't kind of like, you know, jump in on the double dutch, you know, they were like, when can I say something? And so we had to create protocols in our voting and our discussion points so that we brought out those who were on conference calls. I just think Zoom has been a lift of an equal playing field in the governance work. And now the second homeowners are fully engaged in the conversation because we're all in the same boat. And so I suspect that'll be a conversation among my board of like, will we ever go back to a bifurcated conference call or, you know, webinar with somebody, you know, a couple of people on the TV screen and the rest of us in the board meeting, because it doesn't create a dynamic in which you're accomplishing what the goals of a board really are, which is engagement. And so, yeah, I think you need to take that on as a governance conversation, but absolutely recognize them as a stakeholder and the opportunity to expand.
Yeah. And what I'm doing with my, at least again, because I'm trying to kind of figure out what the future is going to look like, is to Stacy's point, having certain ones that are required in person. And if they know that in advance, they know they need to be at their second home for that in-person meeting. That retreats all need to be in person, and maybe even out of deference to them, having 2 board meetings through Zoom. So everybody's on Zoom and are an equal playing field. So there's lots of ways you can accomplish that and still, you know, honor the people who want to participate and give back. Particularly given that they may have a talent that you really need on your board, and they could very easily do their work. So let's end with board engagement, because even though we have all these technical requirements around being a board, at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, it's all about engagement. My deep belief about any volunteer, board included, is that people come for the mission, they stay because they enjoy what they're doing. And they deeply are energetic about the people that they're working with, not just the mission. So engagement is a key piece. And again, engagement seems like a really big word that sometimes we don't really know what that means. And so I'm going to break this down, give you tools and templates, and give you some action steps that you can follow. So from my perspective, engagement is really that connectivity. You know, is there energy in the room when you walk in? You know, are people engaging between board meetings and not just at board meetings? Is there a conscious conversation where board only gets together? You know, I'm a big fan of executive sessions. I think they should be getting together and talking among themselves without any staff involved. All of those are signs that the board is actually engaged. So as I mentioned, this isn't engagement. When, you know, we've got this cute cartoon where it says, you know, I, everybody's agreeing, but in the back of their heads, they're not agreeing. They're not engaged in what's going on. And so this is the last thing you want, is a bunch of people agreeing to something that they don't really agree with. So rather than talk about engagement, I want to give you some early warning signs of disengagement. So what are some signs and symptoms? So low meeting attendance, poor punctuality. So I watch that pretty regularly with all my board members when I was a CEO and now as a board chair. No contact between meetings. If I haven't heard from a board member, if they haven't followed through on what they're supposed to do, and we spend a lot of time on an efficiency side saying, here's who's responsible for stuff right after the board meeting. So there's no real reason why they wouldn't know that they're responsible for something. High turnover, instability, and then low productivity. And some of this just really has to do with making the board meetings as efficient as possible. Again, keep in mind, board members are volunteers. And so you need to make it easy for them to do their job. How quickly do minutes come out? Do the minutes go into a bunch of detail, or do they have bullets that really delineate, here's what I need you to do before the board meeting? Do you give them templates? When you need them to post on social media, do you give them that template and say, I need you to post on Friday? So that you make it easy for them to actually do their job. So are you disengaged? These are some different warning signs. And here's why we need to pay attention to this. So these are all the things Stacy talked about. When your board is disengaged, you have misalignment of mission, you get dysfunction, you're passive aggressive, you get communication silos, you get all of these different things. But most importantly, you get talent that is underutilized. You get people who are frustrated. You get this, chatty kind of gossip in the community that we just don't need. And so board engagement is one of the most critical parts of actually bringing your board to a level of high functioning. So here's some of the areas that I see that cause disengagement, and here are some of the remedies that I would recommend. And so let me play this out as like a he said, she said thing. So the nonprofits will say, board members don't follow through, like attending or being prepared for meetings. So I hear nonprofits say that to me. Well, then I equally talk to board members and they're like, we want our time respected and obligations to be clear. Board meetings are unstructured and don't add value. Remember, I mentioned very early on that CEO who was really excited about her board meeting going so well when no one actually talked during her board meeting but her and her staff. So some recommendations that I have in this area. And again, we're giving you templates along that. Use a board commitment form or a contract so it's really clear what you're asking them to actually do. Create agreed upon ground rules for meetings. In fact, I have a board who starts every single meeting by reading every single ground rule, so everybody knows what those ground rules are. Create, as Stacy said, a strong onboarding process, including proper vetting and board orientation. No one should start at their first board meeting and not have seen the strategic plan, not sign the contract, not sign a conflict of interest, not had a fully vetted interview where all of their questions are answered, and really not pushing the process too quickly for them, making sure that you've been really clear about what their obligations are. And they've said, to the extent that I know at this moment, I can put this work in over the next 2-3 years. So making sure that we're not just filling seats, because I would prefer to not have a seat filled than to fill it with someone who's inappropriate for the role or not ready for the role or is jumping into the role without having the full knowledge. Because again, day one, they're voting on things that are critically important for the mission of the organization. So I would establish common expectations. And in the materials, there's a sample job description. So I'd make sure that you have a sample job description for them. And I've given you some different possibilities here. There's a board contract and checklist. So the board's duty to the organization and the organization's duty to the board. Ground rules, I've given you some samples here. I start with this. And then I wanted to give you a good example from a board that I worked with recently, the City of Garland. And they came up with their own board rules and they start this out. And this is what they start out with. And then of course, a board manual or an online portal. So it used to be you'd get this book as a board member. Well, now we're all online. And so people have a Dropbox or people have a board portal. There's some really good, quick and dirty board portals that are out there. So I'd encourage you to look at what exists already from a software point of view. And it's so much easier for you just to put all this stuff in one place for them so they know where to go if they need anything and they can look at past history. So just know that this is also something that in your checklist for this action plan, you may say, you know what, this is a good year for us to come up with this board portal or for us to come up with a board Dropbox if you don't have one already. And then as I mentioned, I wanted to end on these kind of scenarios. And I've got a little bit more content left, but I wanted you to actually see these. Because the only way to really build a social contract is to agree upon when things happen, what do you do? And so when I do a retreat, part of what we do is we do a board training. So I use this exact same board training for board retreats. So that's your gift. If you decide you want to do an orientation or a governance training, you can take any one of these slides and share them with your board. You can use these in your board orientation if you want. But we spend the bulk of our time, because I'm a big believer that meetings are collision points, like they're opportunities for you to talk about things. We built these scenarios. And so the board then deliberates, what do we want to have done around these scenarios? What's appropriate given our governance model? What is appropriate given our social contract? And so you can see there's lots of different examples here. And they represent all the things we've talked about related to conflicts of interest, related to negative feedback, related to staff interactions. And again, there is no right answer to this. I can give you my recommendation of what I see most nonprofits do, and that may be what we qualify as best practice, but truly just having this conversation will help you avoid issues in the future. So you're welcome to use this slide and come up with others. And by the way, these are real life scenarios that actually happened. And so I have used these over the years, but these are all things that actually happened. And you'll notice, Colleen, we've got the new idea one on here. The next one is establishing regular feedback mechanisms. So in order for an organization to be accountable, they have to know what they're accountable to. And so again, remember what we talked about with mental models. I may have my version of what success is, but other people may say, this is what a functioning board looks like, or this is what I expect a CEO to do in his or her report. So if you think about it from a nonprofit perspective, you have a CEO oftentimes, or an executive director or a staff member saying, I don't know what my board thinks about me. I'd like to know their opinion. Board members saying, I don't know how to appropriately give feedback. So I would encourage at least an annual experience where you're regularly giving feedback in all the ways that are appropriate. So first, creating that dashboard like we talked about. Second, you should be evaluating the chief executive, executive director, even if that person's in a volunteer role. And then lastly, having an opportunity for there to be a 360. So in addition to the CEO being evaluated, the board needs to evaluate itself. And in that evaluation, getting recommendations from the CEO about what is working and what is not working. And that's where the social contract comes together. In the CEO evaluation, you say, here's some things that we noticed, and you figure out where were the miscommunications, where were the misfires, and you do better the next year. Same thing with the board. Stacy talked about it. Sometimes it's a work in progress, and you may need to revise the social contract on the fly because circumstances have changed. And so that's perfectly appropriate as well, but you have to have an intentional conversation about that. But I would recommend on an annual basis to retroactively look back and say, how are we doing from a performance perspective? So I wanted to share with you some slides from an actual nonprofit of what that looks like. And we're going to share with you our SurveyMonkey of how we do this. It's pretty easy. You know, you guys get the SurveyMonkey after this of kind of what your evaluation of us is going to be. And so, you know, how enjoyable do they find the work? You can see, you know, the vast majority of board members in this organization found it enjoyable, but there were a number who found it not enjoyable. Well, those are some people we need to have a conversation with. What makes them feel the most connected? Board meetings, volunteering, etc. So you can see we put together these slides in order to help people understand where the board was. Then we also looked at their responsibilities and basically said, here are all the various responsibilities in the rows. We also have a benchmark score, and you can see we easily contrasted that with their score, and where there's yellow, there's work to do, where there's red, there's a lot of work to do, and where there's green, you can pat yourself on the back and say, you know what, we're doing good in that category. And so these are opportunities for additional professional development, et cetera. And then we also look at them across all these enablers. So everything we talked about was size, CEO evaluation, support materials. You can really grade yourself on how the board thinks you're doing in these areas. And so you can see in this particular one, the board's doing pretty well. They're X in this category. So they're above the gray line. There's a couple of areas where they're close to the line. So maybe they need to have a work fund balance opportunity. So they need to have some time to get together. Size, obviously they need to revisit size because they're thinking their size may not be the right size. Maybe it's too big, maybe it's too small. But I would encourage you to get this data. And as a board, you should be collecting this data on yourself and sending the message to the staff that data collection is critical. And review of that data and action based on that data is critically important. You may decide you want to do a board meeting evaluation. I have a couple of boards who struggle with their meetings. And so they've reconstructed their meetings, and over the course of the first couple of meetings, they do a board evaluation. And once they get their meetings as kind of in routine, then they actually will fix this. And they won't do this anymore. But if you feel like your board meetings aren't great, this is an opportunity for you to find out what you could be doing better. Questions on engagement. I think my final thought on this, on engagement, is that it seems like it's a lot of work. But I think if you put the work in at the upfront level, and you set standards for your contract, for how you're going to do orientation, and you do figure out your policy governance model, all of those things, if you do those, it will be fuel behind the board, and the board will then come together as a cohesive group and self-govern itself. And so part of the process is really just once you develop it, it then becomes a much easier moving forward. So I'd encourage you, as you look at your board action plan, so there's a part in that template for governance to put a couple of these things and decide what this year will we work on to make our board that much more effective, that much more engaged. And then put yourself in the board's shoes. And some of you are board members, and so you can identify with this. Others of you are CEOs and executive directors and probably serve on boards, but they really are in it because they want to do a lot of good for the community. They want to channel their energy. They want to better understand. They want to contribute their leadership. They want to strengthen causes that are important to them. They want to build their networks and relationships, which is why that work-fund balance is so important. All of these things, based on a Fast Company survey, are the things that they're trying to figure out. So know that there's lots of reasons why people come to serve on boards. And it's part of our opportunity to really make sure that all of those things get done. All right, any final thoughts or questions? I know we've covered a lot of territory. We're going to give you lots of templates, lots of tools. And so hopefully one of these things will be something that you'll put on your action plan. And I'm obviously here to stay online, and Stacy is too, to answer any remaining questions. I know we're out of time just because we had such good, robust conversation and questions as we went along the way. But any final thoughts or any final questions as we kind of let you guys go?
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Everyone, I know you're dropping off now with other commitments, but please look for the really brief survey that will be in your inbox almost immediately after this, and give us your feedback on this session, as well as, email me if you've got any comments overall about what we've done through this nonprofit series. Again, we want to tailor this to your needs, and we have tried our absolute best. And I just cannot thank Suzanne enough for harnessing all of our challenges and being so intentional in addressing all of them, and custom tailoring this to our area and to the challenges that were brought up for us. So again, thank you so much, Suzanne. We really have appreciated your guidance through this and bringing your other peers into this. The experts that you brought in for the other sessions were also wonderful as well. And so we just thank you for the whole thing. And it's hard to believe it's already over, that this has been 5 weeks of this. So thank you for that and keeping the momentum going through the whole thing. We really appreciate it.
Suzanne, thanks
Stacy,
to you
yeah.
and your team. That was just fantastic. We've had so many positive comments, not only in today's chat, but throughout the series. And so we look forward to our next opportunity to collaborate with you, and anybody who wants access and information to how to find Suzanne and her team. You can find it through Phyllis and also on this, this feed. Suzanne has a great blog and newsletter, Social Impact Architects. And I encourage you to sign up for her newsletter. It's really powerful.
Right.
Definitely.
Well, we'll all the information in a couple of minutes to you guys, including the evaluation, but it's really been my honor. And so if there's anything I can do, whether it's later today or it's in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out. I know a number of us are giving our pro bono hours to follow up with you guys. So we're happy to do that. That is just, our service to you and the service that you're doing to the community. It's just our absolute pleasure. So thank you guys, and have a weekend, hopefully.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Take care.
Thank you.